Hey guys, Dan here. AMD released the new 9800X3D. The older 7800X3D was the best gaming CPU you could buy till now, and it's not really surprising that the 9800X3D actually is quite a bit better. So without a lot of talking around it, we'll go to the benchmark. The difference is this does clock higher. The 3D cache is not on top of the chip, it's basically below the chip, so the temperatures are a bit lower and you can overclock it. I did some benchmarks with an easy overclock. You can definitely push the chip more, but I did something that every chip probably should be able to achieve. If you're interested how to do that, I'll actually show the process how to do that overclock on my flight simulation channel. I put the link in the description below if you're interested in that. Also, if you're interested in results regarding Microsoft Flight Simulator, that's also on that channel. Price, the 7800X3D currently in Germany is around 460, 470 euros. The 9800X3D is 529, so it's kind of no-brainer to get the newer one. But when the prices drop, it might be an option to buy the 7000 series to save some money without sacrificing too much performance. I also still have my old 14900K that I put in the results as well, but I'd say we'll have a look at the benchmarks now. So I've done 4 scenarios, iRacing in an IMSA grid in the dry at Spa, both in 1080p single screen and 1440p triples, and then I've done the same for Montreal, GT3, race start, in the wet. I've also done some benchmarks for 4K triples, but there's literally no difference between the processors, so I'm not going to show the results. But yeah, if we have a look at iRacing 1920 by 180 FOV, if you do benchmarks, always important because the wider the FOV, the lower the FPS. I've done the single screen benchmark with a 60-degree FOV. Then I'm running the Windows 11 24H2 build. And for all the AMD processors, we are using 6000 MHz CL30 RAM, and the Intel is on 7800 MHz CL36 RAM. iRacing is a game that is very hard to benchmark, so depending on the scenario, the numbers might look different. But this should give a rough estimation of how the processors perform, at least in my scenario. It might look a little bit different on your system, but this is what I've done, and in the end, I can only present you my results. But if we look at this, I mean, all the processors are more than fast enough. Single screen, iRacing, absolutely no problem at all, especially in the dry. If we look at the Intel, we have an average of 300, very comparable to the 7800X3D actually. The lows are actually a little bit better on the Intel. That always fluctuates from iRacing build to iRacing build. I'm not using old numbers here. I'm doing all the benchmarks from scratch. I've benchmarked the 7800X3D in the past where the lows were better than on the Intel, but yeah, it depends on the scenario. It depends on the iRacing build. I feel like iRacing is going more into a GPU bottleneck scenario with the updates, whereas in the past it was strictly CPU bottleneck in nearly all situations. But yeah, so 7800X3D and 14900K very comparable. Then the 9800X3D is quite a bit faster than the 7800X3D. If you look at the average, 361 compared to 302. And also the 1% lows and 0.2% lows quite a bit higher than on the 7800X3D. And if you do the overclock, you can basically get some extra FPS for free. Like I said, if you're interested in how to do that, watch the other video on the Flight Simulation channel. If we go to the 1440p benchmarks for Spa, then you will see we actually introduce a GPU bottleneck. There's not a huge difference in the average FPS on all processors. I mean, 120 on the 14900K compared to 128 on the overclocked 9800X3D. By the way, I know you can overclock the Intel very well, but I'm not an overclocking expert. If people can push the Intel chip way better possible, I just lack the knowledge. So on the AMD, it was very easy. So I included these results, but yeah, keep in mind you can also overclock Intel typically better than AMD. If we look at the 1% low and the 0.2% low numbers, it's also kind of comparable. I mean, the Intel here with the 92 compared to 101 on the overclocked AMD, so it's roughly all in a similar ballpark and definitely not these big differences compared to what we saw on 1080p single screen. Then if we go to Montreal, again we'll start with a single screen benchmark because that's typically more indicative what the CPU can do. We also see a big difference between the 7800X3D and the 9800X3D, 174 compared to 244 on the overclocked one. And we have a 1% low on the overclocked 9800X3D that almost compares to the average on the 7800X3D, which is pretty crazy. And then the Intel is also roughly comparable to the 7800X3D, little lower on the average, but higher on the 1%, which is typically the more interesting number, because whether you have 140 FPS or 200 FPS, it's almost not noticeable. But the drops, like the FPS where it drops really into the stuttery areas, this is where these 1% and 0.2% numbers are actually interesting. So don't always just look at the average, but also look at these 1% numbers. And then if we look at the 1440p triple numbers, again, we see a GPU bottleneck being introduced and all processors being relatively close. There's like a difference of 10 FPS, both in the average and in the 1% low numbers. But still, I think for sim racing, it doesn't really make much sense to buy Intel anymore, because the AMDs are cheaper. They use less power. They are very stable now on the new platform. I remember AMD 5000 series was quite the nightmare, especially with USB when it released. But that is not the case anymore here. The benchmarks in the wet were made with SSR turned off. With SSR on, the GPU bottleneck got even crazier, and there was basically no difference between all the processors. So keep in mind, the 9800X3D is the fastest CPU that you can get right now for sim racing. Also on ACC, I haven't prepared any charts, but it's roughly 15 to 20% faster than the 7800X3D in any scenario. But the higher you go in the resolution, I mean 4K triples, whatever, by a 4090 and pretty much any CPU will be fine, because you're so heavily GPU bottlenecked. But even on 1440p triples these days, you are mostly GPU bottlenecked, which is kind of a change to what happened in the past, where I saw more CPU bottlenecks. I mean, iRacing is evolving, Windows is evolving, 24H2. I've redone all these benchmarks compared to 23H2, and especially the AMDs do benefit a little bit. Like I see 4 to 5% higher FPS with that build. But yeah, these are pretty much the results for the 9800X3D. Definitely the best CPU you can buy. Intel is not irrelevant, especially if you go to lower priced CPUs. For example, the 14600K is a really, really good CPU in terms of price performance. But if you want the best of the best, go AMD. It's quite a bit ahead on iRacing, and it's like insanely ahead on ACC. But that's it already for the video. If you're interested how to do the OC, I'll link the link to the other channel in the description, so you can watch that. And with that being said, thank you all for watching. See you in the next one. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, blah, blah, blah. Bye-bye.